On November 23, 2019, at exactly 11:47 p.m., nurse Margaret Thompson finished the most exhausting shift of her 20-year career. 3 cardiac arrests, 2 overdoses, and a 17-year-old girl who didn't make it home for Thanksgiving dinner. Margaret was walking across the dimly lit hospital parking lot in Lincoln Park, Chicago, her scrub still stained with someone else's blood, her mind replaying every decision she'd made that night. The wind cut through her thin jacket as she fumbled for her car keys, thinking about her own daughter waiting at home, probably asleep on the couch with homework scattered across the coffee table. She was 52 years old, divorced, tired, and just wanted to collapse into her own bed. But then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it over the howling wind. A whimper. Desperate, broken, human. Margaret Thompson had a choice in that moment. Keep walking to her Honda Civic, drive the 23 minutes home to her quiet suburban house and pretend she never heard anything. Or investigate that sound and change the course of multiple lives forever. What she discovered behind that dumpster would trigger a police investigation spanning 4 states, expose a predator who had been hunting for over a decade, and prove that sometimes the difference between life and death is one person choosing to care when it's easier to walk away. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Thompson wasn't born a hero. She grew up in working-class Detroit, the daughter of a factory worker and a secretary who taught her that if you see someone hurting, you help them. Period. No questions asked, no excuses. After high school, she put herself through nursing school by working double shifts at a diner, studying between coffee refills and burger orders. She married young, had 2 kids, divorced when her husband decided he preferred gambling over family responsibility. For 20 years, she'd been the kind of ER nurse who stayed late with scared teenagers, who held the hands of dying patients when their families couldn't make it in time, who gave her lunch money to homeless people who came to the emergency room just to get warm. Margaret had seen humanity at its absolute worst, but somehow she still believed in its capacity for good. That belief would be tested in ways she never imagined. The voice Margaret heard that night belonged to 19-year-old Sarah Chen, a sophomore at Northwestern University studying pre-med. Sarah was the kind of student every parent dreams of having. Dean's List every semester, volunteer at the campus food bank, called her parents in Sacramento every Sunday without fail. Her mother, Linda, had immigrated from Taiwan in 1985 with nothing but a nursing degree and enough determination to build a new life for the family she hoped to have someday. Her father, David, worked 16-hour days at his accounting firm to pay for Sarah's tuition, proud that his daughter would be the first doctor in their family. Sarah was responsible, careful, smart. She'd never gotten so much as a speeding ticket. She chose her friends carefully, studied hard, and stayed away from parties and drama. Which is exactly why what happened to her was so shocking. Because evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it wears the expensive suit and drives a luxury car and knows exactly what to say to make a smart girl feel special. Michael Harrison was 34 years old and looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for success. 6 feet tall, perfectly styled brown hair, a smile that had charmed his way through Northwestern's business school and into a corner office at one of Chicago's most prestigious real estate firms. He drove a black BMW, lived in a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. Michael was smooth, confident, articulate. He knew wine, could recommend restaurants, talked about traveling to Europe like it was as casual as driving to the grocery store. To the women he met on dating apps, he seemed perfect. Successful, mature, interested in something serious. But Michael Harrison had a secret that would horrify anyone who knew him. For 8 years he'd been hunting. Carefully, methodically. Always college students. Always smart, responsible girls from good families. Girls who trusted him because he looked like the kind of man their parents would approve of. Girls who never saw the monster underneath until it was too late. Sarah met Michael on a dating app in September 2019. She'd just ended a relationship with her college boyfriend, someone her own age who still thought dinner at Taco Bell counted as a date. Her roommate Jessica convinced her to try online dating, said she needed to meet someone more mature, someone with goals and ambition. Sarah was reluctant but finally created a profile, posted a few photos from a family vacation, wrote something about wanting to find someone serious about the future. Michael was her third match. His profile was perfect. Successful real estate investor, loved hiking and trying new restaurants, looking for someone intelligent and ambitious to build a life with. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. He asked about her studies, her family, her dreams of becoming a pediatrician. He listened. He remembered details. He made her feel heard in a way her college boyfriend never had. Their first date was at a Linnea, one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants. Michael picked her up in his BMW, opened her car door, pulled out her chair. He ordered wine that cost more per bottle than Sarah spent on groceries in a month. He talked about his business, his travels, his 5-year plan. He asked thoughtful questions about her medical school applications, her research on childhood cancer treatment, her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. Sarah felt sophisticated, adult, valued. When he kissed her goodnight on her doorstep, she thought she might have found the person she'd spend her life with. What she didn't know was that Michael had done this exact same thing 17 times before. Same restaurant, same wine, same questions, same kiss goodnight. He'd perfected his routine over 8 years of hunting, learned exactly what to say to make intelligent women trust him completely. The second date was a weekend in Wisconsin, staying at a bed and breakfast Michael claimed he'd discovered on a business trip. Sarah told her parents she was going on a study retreat with classmates, told Jessica she was visiting her aunt in Milwaukee. She'd never lied to her family before, but she felt embarrassed about dating someone so much older, someone so obviously wealthy when her family had struggled for everything they had. The weekend was perfect. Michael was attentive, romantic, interested in everything about her life. He talked about meeting her parents, about supporting her through medical school, about the house they'd buy together someday. Sarah felt like she was living in a fairy tale. What she didn't realize was that she was actually living in a carefully constructed trap that had taken Michael years to perfect. Every romantic gesture, every thoughtful question, every promise about their future together was part of a pattern he'd used to isolate and control other women. Women who were now missing. By October, Michael's behavior began to change, but so gradually that Sarah didn't recognize the warning signs until it was too late. He started asking more questions about her schedule, her friends, her family. Where was she going? Who was she with? Why hadn't she texted him back within an hour? He framed it as concern, as love, as wanting to be part of every aspect of her life. Sarah felt flattered that someone so successful wanted to know every detail about her day. She didn't realize that Michael was mapping her routine, identifying her vulnerabilities, learning how to control her completely. He began showing up at her classes unexpectedly, bringing her coffee and claiming he was in the neighborhood for work meetings. He offered to drive her everywhere, said it wasn't safe for a young woman to walk around campus alone at night. Sarah's friends began to notice changes in her behavior. She stopped joining them for study groups, turned down invitations to go out, seemed constantly worried about checking her phone. Jessica confronted Sarah in early November, told her that Michael was giving off controlling vibes and that she was worried about her roommate's safety. Sarah defended him, said Jessica was jealous that she'd found someone mature and successful while Jessica was still dating college boys who played video games all day. But privately, Sarah was beginning to feel suffocated. Michael wanted to spend every free moment together. He criticized her friends, said they were immature, and would hold her back from achieving her goals. He questioned her commitment to their relationship when she chose to study instead of seeing him. He made her feel guilty for wanting time alone, for maintaining friendships he didn't approve of, for pursuing interests he didn't share. Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, constantly worried about saying or doing something that would upset him. She was losing herself in trying to be the person he wanted her to be. When Sarah finally decided to end the relationship, She thought the hardest part would be hurting someone she'd once believed she loved. She had no idea that she was actually trying to escape from a predator who had no intention of letting her go. She met Michael at a coffee shop near campus on November 15th, planning to have a calm, mature conversation about why they weren't compatible long-term. She'd practiced what she was going to say, how she'd explain that she needed to focus on her studies and wasn't ready for such a serious relationship. Michael listened quietly as Sarah spoke, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he smiled that same charming smile that had attracted her in the first place. Then he pulled out his phone and showed her something that made her blood run cold. Photos of her sleeping in his bed. Private moments she'd never consented to being recorded. Images that would destroy her reputation, her family's respect, her future career, before it even began. Michael's voice was calm, reasonable, almost gentle as he explained Sarah's new reality. The photos would disappear if she continued their relationship. If she broke up with him, if she told anyone about their conversation, if she tried to avoid him, the pictures would be sent to her parents, her professors, her medical school applications committee, everyone she'd ever known. He'd researched her family's traditional values, knew exactly how devastating this would be for her conservative immigrant parents who'd sacrificed everything for their daughter's education and future. Sarah felt trapped, humiliated, terrified. She agreed to continue seeing Michael, hoping she could find a way out of the situation without destroying her family's honor and her own dreams. But Michael's demands escalated quickly. He wanted to see her every night. He wanted her to drop her volunteer activities and spend all her free time with him. He wanted access to her social media accounts, her email, her phone. He isolated her from friends and family, made her financially dependent on him, controlled every aspect of her life. For 3 weeks, Sarah lived in hell. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on her studies. Her grades began to slip. She lost 15 pounds. Her parents noticed during their weekly phone calls that their daughter sounded different, stressed, but Sarah insisted she was just busy with midterms. Jessica knew something was seriously wrong, but Sarah refused to talk about it, claimed everything was fine with Michael, that they were just going through a rough patch. Sarah felt completely alone, trapped in a situation that got worse every day, but that she couldn't escape without losing everything she'd worked for her entire life. She began researching ways to disappear, considered dropping out of school and moving across the country, thought about ending her own life rather than continuing to live as Michael's prisoner. She had no idea that she was living through the exact same pattern that had destroyed other women, women who'd simply vanished when they'd tried to escape. Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous as November progressed. He accused Sarah of cheating when she was 5 minutes late meeting him. He went through her belongings looking for evidence of betrayal. He followed her to classes, called her professors, claiming to be her boyfriend, checking on her attendance. Sarah realized that Michael wasn't just controlling, he was becoming completely unhinged. She began to fear for her physical safety but felt powerless to escape. Every time she considered telling someone about her situation, she remembered those photos and the threats about what would happen to her family's reputation if she defied him. Michael had successfully isolated her from everyone who might have helped her, made her believe that she was alone in the world with no options except to submit to his demands completely. On November 22nd, Sarah made a desperate decision. She'd found online forums for abuse survivors, learned about resources for women in her situation, discovered that she wasn't alone in experiencing this kind of manipulation and control. She realized that Michael was never going to let her go willingly, that the situation would only get worse until he either killed her or drove her to kill herself. She decided to meet with a counselor at the university's women's center, to report Michael to the police, to tell her parents the truth regardless of the consequences. She thought the hardest part of her ordeal was behind her. She had no idea that Michael had been monitoring her internet activity, reading her emails, tracking her every movement through spyware he'd installed on her devices. She had no idea that her decision to seek help had triggered the most dangerous phase of Michael's pattern, and she had no idea that she was about to become his first victim to fight back. Michael confronted Sarah outside her dormitory on the evening of November 22nd, his usual charm replaced by cold fury. He knew about her research into domestic violence resources. He knew she'd made an appointment with a counselor. He knew she was planning to betray him after everything he'd done for her, after all the money he'd spent on their relationship, after he'd opened his heart to her in ways he'd never done for any other woman. Sarah tried to reason with him, to explain that she just needed space to focus on her studies, that their relationship had become too intense too quickly. Michael wasn't listening. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, told her she was coming with him right now to discuss their relationship like adults. Sarah tried to pull away, told him he was hurting her, that people were watching. Michael's grip tightened. He smiled at the students walking past, waved casually, acted like they were just having a normal conversation while his fingers dug into Sarah's arm with bruising force. Sarah got into Michael's car because she was afraid of what he'd do if she caused a scene in public. She thought if she went with him voluntarily, she could talk him down, convince him to let her go, find a way to de-escalate the situation without anyone getting hurt. It was the last rational decision she'd make for hours. Michael drove to an empty parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from campus, far from anyone who might hear or help. Sarah's phone had no signal. The area was dark, isolated, perfect for what Michael had planned. He turned off the engine and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. The mask of the charming, successful businessman had completely fallen away. What remained was something cold and predatory, and utterly without empathy. Michael told Sarah exactly what was going to happen next. She was going to disappear. Her family would think she'd run away, couldn't handle the pressure of medical school, had gotten involved with drugs or gambling or some other shameful behavior that explained why their perfect daughter had vanished without a trace. The police would investigate for a few weeks, find no evidence of foul play, eventually classify her as a missing person who'd probably started a new life somewhere else. Her parents would spend the rest of their lives wondering what they'd done wrong, blaming themselves for their daughter's disappearance. And Michael would be the grieving boyfriend who'd tried so hard to help Sarah with her problems, but ultimately couldn't save her from herself. He'd done this before, multiple times. He knew exactly how to make women disappear without leaving evidence that would connect back to him. Sarah listened to Michael's plan with growing horror, realizing that she wasn't his first victim, that other women had died because of this man's need for control and dominance. She thought about her parents, who'd worked so hard to give her opportunities they'd never had. She thought about her little brother, who looked up to her and wanted to be a doctor like his big sister someday. She thought about all the children she'd planned to help as a pediatrician, all the lives she'd hoped to save and improve. Sarah Chen had been raised to be polite, compliant, to avoid confrontation and trust authority figures. But sitting in that car, listening to a predator describe how he was going to murder her and destroy her family's peace forever, something fundamental shifted inside her. She wasn't going to die quietly. She wasn't going to disappear without a fight. And she wasn't going to let Michael Harrison hurt any other women the way he'd hurt her. Sarah's first opportunity came when Michael got out of the car to open the trunk, where he kept supplies he'd used to dispose of other victims. She tried to run, but her legs were shaking so badly from fear and adrenaline that she stumbled and fell before she'd made it 20 feet. Michael caught her easily, laughed at her pathetic attempt to escape, told her that running would only make things worse for her family when he released those photos posthumously as evidence of her moral corruption. He dragged her back to the car by her hair, threw her against the hood hard enough that she saw stars. Sarah tasted blood in her mouth, felt something warm running down her forehead where her head had hit the metal. Michael was no longer pretending to be civilized. He was enjoying her terror, feeding off her helplessness, taking pleasure in having complete power over someone who dared to defy him. But Sarah hadn't survived 19 years as the daughter of immigrants, hadn't earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, hadn't worked her way through college while maintaining a perfect GPA by giving up when things got difficult. While Michael was distracted retrieving rope and plastic sheeting from his trunk, Sarah grabbed a tire iron he'd left on the ground and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The metal connected with Michael's shoulder, sending him staggering backward with a roar of pain and rage. Sarah ran again, this time with adrenaline overriding her fear, her survival instincts finally kicking in after weeks of learned helplessness. She made it almost to the street before Michael tackled her, both of them going down hard on the asphalt. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Michael was stronger, heavier, trained in martial arts from his college days. But Sarah was fighting for her life, for her future, for her family's peace of mind, for all the other women who'd never gotten the chance to fight back. She clawed at his face, bit his hands when he tried to cover her mouth, screamed until her throat was raw even though she knew no one was around to hear her. Michael beat her systematically, methodically, the way someone beats a dog to break its spirit. He told her that her parents would be ashamed of how their daughter died, that she was nothing but a worthless whore who'd gotten what she deserved. Sarah felt her ribs crack, felt blood filling her mouth, felt consciousness slipping away as Michael's hands closed around her throat. Just when she thought she was going to die in that parking lot, forgotten and alone, Sarah remembered something her father had told her when she was little and afraid of the dark. He'd said that even in the darkest night, there's always a small light somewhere if you're brave enough to look for it. Sarah stopped fighting Michael's superior strength and instead went limp, played dead, let him think he'd finally broken her completely. When he loosened his grip to check her pulse, she drove her knee upward with the last of her strength, connecting with the most vulnerable part of his anatomy. Michael doubled over in agony, and Sarah ran toward the distant glow of streetlights, toward civilization, toward help, toward the voice of someone who might care enough to save her life. Margaret Thompson had finished the worst shift of her nursing career and just wanted to go home to her quiet house, her sleeping daughter, her predictable life where the only chaos came from medical emergencies she was trained to handle. She was thinking about whether she had enough energy to make dinner or if frozen pizza would have to suffice again, when she heard the sound that changed everything. At first, she thought it might be an injured animal, maybe a cat hit by a car and crawling away to die. But as she moved closer to her Honda Civic, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human. Someone was crying. Someone was hurt. Someone needed help in the middle of the night in an empty parking lot where most people would assume they were alone. Margaret's first instinct was self-preservation. She was a middle-aged woman alone in the dark, tired and vulnerable. The smart thing would be to get in her car, lock the doors, and call security from the safety of her vehicle. But 20 years of emergency medicine had trained her to run toward crisis, not away from it. She'd seen too many people die because someone had chosen convenience over compassion, had witnessed too many tragedies that could have been prevented if someone had simply cared enough to act. Margaret pulled out her phone's flashlight and followed the sound of crying toward a dumpster behind the hospital's loading dock, an area she'd walked past thousands of times but never really examined closely. What she found there would haunt her dreams for years to come. A young woman, beaten so badly her own mother might not have recognized her, curled into a ball behind piles of medical waste. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with blood, her face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. But she was alive. She was conscious. And when Margaret's flashlight found her, she looked up with eyes that held both terror and desperate hope. Margaret's medical training took over immediately. She assessed the injuries, checked for breathing and pulse, and signs of internal bleeding, all while speaking in the calm, reassuring voice she used with trauma patients who needed to trust her completely in order to survive. Sarah's first words were barely audible through her swollen lips, but Margaret heard them clearly. "Please don't leave me alone. He said he'd come back to finish the job." Margaret assured Sarah that she was safe, that help was coming, that no one was going to hurt her again. She called 911, gave her location, requested ambulance and police backup, all while keeping one hand on Sarah's shoulder to let her know she wasn't alone anymore. Margaret stayed with Sarah through the ambulance ride, through the emergency room examination, through the police interviews, through the long night that marked the beginning of the end for Michael Harrison's 8-year killing spree. She didn't know Sarah's name, didn't know her story, didn't know anything about the nightmare that had led to this moment. All she knew was that a young woman had needed help, and she'd been in the right place at the right time to provide it. Detective James Rodriguez had worked violent crimes for 12 years and thought he'd seen every variation of human cruelty possible. But Sarah Chen's case disturbed him in ways that surprised even his experienced colleagues. The level of premeditation, the psychological manipulation, the careful planning that had gone into isolating and terrorizing this young woman suggested they were dealing with someone who'd done this before. When Sarah was finally able to speak coherently, 2 days after her rescue, her story revealed a pattern of behavior that sent cold chills through everyone who heard it. Michael Harrison wasn't just an abusive boyfriend who'd lost control. He was a predator who'd spent years perfecting his methods of hunting and disposing of victims. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the Chicago Police Department had handled in recent memory. Michael's apartment yielded evidence of at least 6 other women who'd disappeared over the past 8 years, all college students, all matching Sarah's profile, all last seen with a man matching Michael's description. There were photographs, personal items, detailed journals documenting his interactions with each victim. Michael had kept trophies from his kills, souvenirs that proved he'd successfully eliminated women who'd tried to escape his control. Sarah was the first to survive long enough to identify him, the first to fight back effectively, the first to escape and tell authorities what had really happened to all those missing girls whose cases had gone cold. Michael Harrison was arrested at his office 3 days after Sarah's rescue, surrounded by colleagues who couldn't believe that their successful, charming coworker was capable of the crimes he was accused of committing. He maintained his innocence initially, claimed that Sarah was a disturbed young woman who'd become obsessed with him and was making up stories to get attention. His expensive lawyers argued that there was no physical evidence connecting him to the other missing women, that Sarah's testimony was unreliable due to her head injuries, that their client was being railroaded by a police department desperate to solve cold cases. But Michael's own documented obsession with his victims ultimately became the evidence that convicted him. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated Chicago news coverage throughout the spring of 2020. Sarah testified for 8 hours over 2 days, describing in detail how Michael had manipulated, isolated, and ultimately tried to murder her. Her courage in facing her attacker, in reliving her trauma publicly, in ensuring that he could never hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt her, inspired domestic violence survivors across the country. Michael showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, seemed more angry about being caught than sorry for the lives he'd destroyed. When the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, Sarah Chen finally felt safe enough to begin the long process of healing from her ordeal. Michael Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but for the families of his other victims, there would be no real closure. Ashley Morrison's parents had spent 3 years believing their daughter might still be alive somewhere, might come home for Christmas someday. Jennifer Walsh's little sister had kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it, convinced that Jennifer would eventually call and explain where she'd been. Melissa Torres's mother had hired private investigators, consulted psychics, never stopped searching for the daughter who'd vanished without a trace during her junior year of college. Learning the truth about their daughter's fates brought a kind of peace, but also a grief that would never fully heal. They'd been robbed not only of their children's lives, but of years of hope and wondering and holding on to the possibility that someday their families would be whole again. Sarah Chen spent the next year recovering from her physical and psychological injuries, learning to sleep without nightmares, to trust her own judgment again, to believe that she deserved love and respect and kindness. She changed her major from pre-med to social work, decided that she wanted to help other survivors of domestic violence instead of pursuing her original dream of pediatric medicine. Her parents supported her decision completely, told her they were proud of her strength and courage, that they'd rather have a living daughter who'd survived hell than lose her to a monster who'd already taken too many other children from their families. Sarah graduated with honors, went on to establish a nonprofit organization that helps young women recognize and escape abusive relationships before it's too late. Margaret Thompson became something of a local hero, featured in newspaper articles and television interviews about the importance of trusting your instincts and helping people in crisis. She deflected most of the attention, insisted that anyone would have done the same thing in her situation, that she'd simply been in the right place at the right time. But Sarah knew better. Margaret had made a choice that night. A conscious decision to investigate a sound that most people would have ignored or rationalized away. That choice had saved Sarah's life and brought justice for 6 other families who'd been living in limbo for years. The 2 women stayed in touch after the trial ended, meeting for coffee every few months, checking in on each other's lives and families. The case changed everyone it touched, from the police officers who'd worked the investigation to the prosecutors who'd secured Michael's conviction, to the jurors who'd listened to weeks of testimony about human cruelty and resilience. It reminded them that evil often wears an attractive mask, that monsters can look like successful businessmen and charming dates and ideal boyfriends. But it also proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when faced with someone else's crisis, that one person's willingness to act can mean the difference between life and death, between justice and impunity, between hope and despair for families who've lost everything. 3 years later, Sarah Chen is a licensed social worker running support groups for domestic violence survivors in Sacramento, close to her parents and the community that raised her. She speaks at universities about recognizing the warning signs of abusive relationships, helps young women understand that love shouldn't hurt, that control isn't the same as caring, that their instincts about dangerous people are usually correct, even when everyone else thinks their boyfriend seems perfect. Sarah tells her audiences about the night Margaret Thompson chose to investigate a sound in the darkness, about how one stranger's compassion saved her life and brought a serial killer to justice. She urges them to trust their intuition, to speak up when something feels wrong, to remember that asking for help isn't weakness, but wisdom. Margaret Thompson still works as an emergency room nurse, still stays late with frightened patients, still gives her lunch money to people who need it more than she does. She doesn't consider herself a hero, just someone who was raised to believe that we're all responsible for taking care of each other. When reporters ask her about that night in November, she says she was just doing what her parents taught her to do. When you hear someone crying in the dark, you go toward the sound instead of away from it. She hopes that if she's ever the one who needs help, someone else will make the same choice she made that night. Margaret keeps a photo on her desk of Sarah's college graduation, a reminder that small acts of courage can have consequences that ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. The case officially closed when Michael Harrison died in prison in 2022, attacked by other inmates who'd learned about his crimes against young women. His death brought mixed feelings to the families he destroyed. Some felt that justice had finally been served completely. Others wished he'd lived longer to suffer the consequences of his actions. Sarah felt mostly relief that she'd never have to worry about him being released on appeal, or escaping, or finding some way to hurt other people. She'd moved on with her life, found love with someone who respected her strength and supported her work, built a career helping other survivors heal from their own experiences with violence and control. But the most important legacy of Sarah's survival isn't Michael Harrison's death or imprisonment. It's the ripple effect of Margaret Thompson's choice to care about a stranger's pain. Every woman Sarah helps recognize an abusive relationship, every survivor who finds the courage to leave a dangerous situation, every family that stays whole because someone learned to identify and escape from a predator, represents a life saved by one person's decision to investigate a sound in the darkness instead of pretending she didn't hear it. Evil flourishes when good people choose convenience over compassion, when we decide that someone else's crisis isn't our responsibility. But sometimes, all it takes to change everything is one person who refuses to walk away from someone else's pain. Margaret Thompson and Sarah Chen proved that ordinary people can defeat monsters, that strangers can become family, that the worst night of your life can become the beginning of your purpose. They proved that listening to that voice in the darkness, even when it's easier to pretend you didn't hear anything, can mean the difference between tragedy and triumph for people you've never met and may never see again. The question isn't whether you'll ever face a moment like Margaret did that night in November. The question is whether you'll have the courage to choose compassion over convenience when that moment comes.